There's a voice that always shows up when we talk about safety. It says, if we don't defend ourselves, we'll be destroyed. It wears a serious face, it sounds reasonable, even noble, and it often speaks the language of deterrence, of strategy and protection. You hear it in policy meetings, you hear it on the news, you hear it in your own gut sometimes, that deep animal instinct that says better safe than sorry. But what if this voice, so committed to our survival, is leading us toward exactly what it wants and seeks to avoid? What if the fortress we build for protection is the very thing that creates the conditions for attack? This is the topic for today, where I'm exploring a difficult, often uncomfortable paradox: how militaristic protectionism and defense strategies, so central to the modern worldview, can actually deepen the threats they aim to diffuse. So, welcome to the Higher Self Dialogues with me, your host, Anton Jarrod. Let's begin with a metaphor. Picture a house on a cliff, weather-beaten, windswept, with the sea gnawing away at its foundation, making the cliff edge longer and longer. The owners of the house, fearing collapse, build walls very high, and they build them higher, and they reinforce the doors. They install cameras and alarms and traps and place heavy missiles all around the garden. But they never address the eroding cliff beneath. This is what our global defense system and our militaristic protectionism looks like from a higher perspective. NATO, Iron Dome, nuclear deterrence, integrated air defense, each one a mighty, heavy wall against an imagined or real adversary, each one a bet placed on the logic that might and force ensures peace. But the ground beneath is trust, mutual understanding, a shared investment in one another's well-being, and that ground is crumbling and disappearing fast. We tell ourselves that these strategies are rational, that they're necessary, but they are also deeply emotional. They're born of fear, of trauma, of ancestral, generational memory that says the world is hostile and the only way to survive is to dominate or be dominated. Let's consider a recent example. Donald Trump, in a speech about Israel's Iron Dome, has praised it as the ultimate protection, a technological marvel shielding Israel from rockets. He recently announced a US version of this same idea. And yet even some of those in Israel, there's one article in The Guardian of a Nissan ZV calling it out as a strategic mistake. Why? Because, in fact, the Israeli Iron Dome could be seen as having normalized being attacked, turning incoming fire into routine, something predictable, reliable. In other words, it helped create a new norm of firing missiles into Israel. Seth Frantzman of the Jerusalem Post went further. He argued that Israel's reliance on Iron Dome has eroded its deterrence, not because the system doesn't work, but because it's become the only line of thinking. It has dulled the imagination, preventing other paths from being taken. And here's the heart of the issue: not that defenses are wrong, but that they have these unintended, unexpected consequences. They shape how we see the world, how we be in the world. They shape how the world sees us, and they shape the dialogue. Across the ocean, here in the UK, there are growing conversations about whether Britain needs its own Iron Dome style system. The spectre of history reveals itself in these discussions. Anxiety, identity crisis, isolation. Russian TV broadcasts show nuclear missiles raining down on London. Now, it doesn't matter if it's just scaremongering, propaganda, or a genuine threat. The response and reaction is real. More military spending, more defences. It's a modern military political doctrine. Now, whilst many would argue that, yes, the suggested military solutions are flawed and that what we need is entirely new or different defences, not the ones that we have, I'm saying that the problem is deeper and that it's not about finding new military defences. The problem is military defence itself. It can become a trap, a way of being, a worldview, one where every neighbour is a potential enemy, one where safety means superiority. And yet, there is another way. The idea of stepping back from defence often immediately provokes outrage. It sounds like weakness. It sounds like appeasement. But it's neither of these. What I'm suggesting here from a higher spiritual perspective is not about doing nothing in the face of aggression. It's about asking what actually prevents aggression, what creates conditions where war doesn't become an option, where it's unthinkable as an option, not because you'd lose, but because the very idea of it is absurd. And history, present history, offers some clues here, flawed though they are. The European Union, for all its bureaucracy and political tension and all the kinds of problems that it has, of which there are many, it has still achieved something extraordinary. It has made war between sovereign countries practically unthinkable, practically impossible. Why? Because the ties have been made too deep, economically, socially, maybe not so much politically, but the integration runs too far, too deep to rip apart. I mean, we take it for granted that European countries have peace, and we think, oh no, of course they're going to be at peace because they're just so similar, they're so small, they're practically neighbours. Of course, peace is easy, but that's an illusion. It wasn't easy. It's never been easy. And remember, these are very different sovereign states that were at total war with each other not that long ago. What has been created is a kind of peace that isn't built by weapons, by defense, by the threat of attack. It's built by cooperation, mutual independence, and yes, by sacrificing a little bit of national ego. Sacrifice is a word that often gets lost in these conversations, but to live in peace, the higher road is that we have to give something up. But what we give up is actually something we want to lose anyway. It means giving up pride, giving up the fantasy of invincibility or great destiny. But what is gained is something bigger, a more stable environment, a more connected humanity, a future that isn't always on the brink. This is hardly utopian thinking, but that's the potential criticism that comes up when you say that world peace can be created without defensiveness. Despite it being plain for all to see how replacing defensiveness with cooperation and integration works. It's in fact deeply practical and realistic. And it's deeply spiritual because At the heart of the need to defend is the fear of being hurt, being annihilated, which at base is the fear of transformation and change that has no real teeth because there is greater prosperity in the change. And in spiritual terms, defensiveness is classic ego. It's the small self clinging to a false identity, mistaking it for essence and truth. When we live more and more from the higher self, we see that security doesn't come from having more weapons, more threats. It comes from having more wisdom, from knowing that real strength is relational, not positional. Now, this doesn't mean that we never set boundaries or that we throw open the gates and hope for the best, but it does mean prioritizing bridges over walls as a kind of first basic principle. It means seeking understanding before retaliation and making peace an active living choice and current policy decision, not just a passive hope or a future reward. Of course, dealing with the consequences of past history, past defensiveness can't be avoided. Past conditions of increasing defensiveness create future, perhaps inevitable conditions in which aggression and aggressors rise. Simply opting for peace mid-course doesn't get rid of tyrants that have been created in previous crucibles of aggression. But we need to ask, truly, where do tyrants come from? What conditions give rise to them? And what were their gripes and complaints? And what role have our own policies and systems played in creating the very enemies that we now arm against? Because the answers are all there as to what the integration and cooperation needs to address. To truly create world peace means disarming internally and externally, which means finally facing the fear that drives our need for control and our habits for separation. It means opening to the possibility that connection can be safer than separation, and that dialogue will achieve what missiles never will. It's not an easy path. In many ways, building missiles is the easier path, but it requires more courage than war. It requires the kind of bravery that looks like humility, that sounds like listening, that goes out on a limb, and, dare we say, trust. Yes, trust is impossible when the bully is already out of the gate and firing. And then you have to have containment. You have to protect people from harm, of course. But then you have to suffer and endure the consequences of the militarism you've helped create and think about peace later. You need to create the conditions of trust. But militarism only creates the conditions of mistrust, and all it does is erode the foundation on which any kind of peace and prosperity can be built on. That's all from me for this week. Thank you for listening to the Higher Self Dialogues. I'm Anton Jarrod. Until next time, stay open, stay connected, and take care.